can I start by saying how was it? Can I ask that question?
Even though we were
no. Okay, welcome back. What we hear from people around here that was a very interesting session, and the facilitators gave us a range of really good comments. So we really appreciate that. And we collected a few of the comments here, which we're trying to discuss a few of the ideas that came up from the session. And just browsing through some of these ideas, I think one of the things that came up in our discussion was this challenge of bringing consensus in the research community. So what actually is learning through play, and how do we understand it from the practitioner point of view, but in particular also from the research point of view. One of the examples was Catherine Snow, who actually, as a top line, said she's worried that there's no clear definition of play and learning. And Catherine is at Harvard from a research point of view. On the other hand, Bertha, she's working in the community in South Africa, talked about that if we want to change the perception of learning through play, we have to start with the community. We have to ensure that the communities value the effects of play, so not only for the policymakers, but also for the communities. And one of the last points on this consensus, Winslow Burleson talked about that actually there's a range of new technologies or infrastructures would allow us to talk about and debate and think about learning through play. So how do you think about this consensus building between research and practice? Is it only research and practice, or is it also other places?
Well, I think it's a really good point, and I'm glad the discussion groups were so rich. I think just one comment before I turn it over to Mitch, which is, I don't think we should get hung up on the fact that there's no one definition of play. I think that's okay, and we shouldn't seek to change it, because you could come up with a beautiful academically crafted definition of play. If that's really what you want to do, it might take 5 years. But I think instead we should focus on figuring out, are there a couple of concepts that everybody thinks are crucial and important? So if everybody lists key concepts or capacities, what are the top 3 or 4 on everybody's list? What's the Venn diagram that everyone agrees about? And then just come up with aligned terms around those. And then we can continue the debate in the academic community around all the other stuff. But then every time people talk, at least whether it's to parents or education personnel or policymakers in particular, you use those core aligned terms and those core concepts, then we'll make a lot of progress.
Maybe one thing I'd say about consensus is sometimes policymakers are especially focused on formal education systems with understandable reasons. But I think when we talk about consensus, it's so important to think not just in schools, but outside of schools, in homes and community centers, how parents think about play and their children growing up as creative thinkers, I think is so important. And in some ways, we can learn from some of the practices that go on outside of schools, but also some of those are shrinking. So I think we have to make sure that we bring those into the discussion and to make sure that as we haven't tried to build a consensus, it's including the parents, community members as part of that vision of what it means to have a rich learning experience.
No, it's a very good point, and probably also that illustrates a point of it's a process to build that consensus, and maybe technologies can do that, or network is able to do that. Around these definitions that we might need to find.
I think it's a great. I mean, you might have to do more than have a discussion through the network, but a network like you're trying to build or help co-create or start is actually a excellent mechanism for starting these conversations. I've seen other topics in the education sector who've used a network to kickstart alignment around a shared set of concepts. I'll give one example. In the field that I have worked in for many years in the past was really around children's well-being in very difficult circumstances, particularly armed conflict, civil wars. And 15 years ago, there was lots of discrete interventions all around the world, people in their own little corners of the globe working really hard, but no attention to this issue at the policy level. And we started with a network of 10, it was 10 people, it was the right agencies, so 10 people, and coming up with what is good quality learning for these kids look like? It's probably going to be different.
Just like the practice.
What does it look like? What are some shared standards? fast forward 10 years, it's an 8,000 member network, 80 countries around the world share that vision and are implementing and doing policy and budgeting around it. So it's possible. And a network is actually a great way to start that movement.
Perfect. Another subject. So many people caught up on the thinking around that actually practitioners could be researchers and researchers are looking at practice. So a few examples from the room 8. So Chris Waters said that schools should allow teachers to do their own research or their own teaching. And Ben Mardell pointed to the Reggio Emilia example where actually teachers are curious and documenting their own practices and trying to investigate what they do. And it goes into the general notion also, Jan Kizhonkov mentioned that actually the adventure of being playful from an adult point of view also, to understand the mindset of how you are curious and explorative and so forth, it's something that should go into both researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. Is that something that's, isn't it a difficult thing to think about playfulness and adults? Policymaking even, I would say, or does it work?
Well, I do think it's often challenging for adults. A lot of times they feel that they have to be more focused on outcomes and efficiency as opposed to exploration. So this play often involves a type of willingness to explore, try new things. And sometimes when people feel, I want a deadline, I have to be efficient, what's the most effective way of doing it? It shuts people down from the type of exploration, which I think is central to the play process. So I do think we have to have people recognize the value of having, it's a type of mindset that they do try to get them to remember from childhood, to keep alive the child inside is part of what we need to help adults do. They have to see the value of it. So I think what we need to do is help people understand the value of it.
But also I like that point because the value of it is also the research of being curious, right? It's not only the outcomes, but that mindset.
I think we need to be realistic in terms of which adults might be better set up to take this on.
Yes.
I mean, let's set aside your personal life, parenting.
Yes.
Because that's up to each individual, and probably through networks of parent networks, you can probably make good progress on that. And focus on professional groups of, in the adult world. I think in companies, you can quickly do this, and some of the very good companies do this. And the fear of failure, higher risk tolerance, you get greater rewards. You look at Google or various other places that get 20% of employees' time, they do their own thing, and various other things. So companies, I think, can do it faster. I think if we get our system right, probably teachers, which I know it's a huge, if the ecosystem around them could support that, they could really be great examples of this. Policymakers in terms of whether it's congressmen or senior administration officials, I think what's going to have to change in the world to get them to work like that is going to take a long time, and it's all about taxpayer money, and failure is never an option. You just spin it some way else. So you're going to have a whole shift in how you think about failure.
But I do think we've been talking about this attitudes at adults. Let's also start with kids themselves. And I think we want to be in this for the long.
More realistic.
But we want to be in this for the long term. Having children really do some reflection about the values of some of these approaches and give them the opportunities. You mentioned the 20% time with Google. There is now an emerging movement of giving students in schools 20% time to work on things they care about. I think that's a great idea. So for them to be able to have some self-directed learning, and it's at least, I personally would give more than 20%, but at least that's a start. Also, I think some of the things when you mentioned the role new technologies can play, one thing we've seen in some of the online communities. So, we've worked on this online community called Scratch, where young people design their own interactive stories, games, animations, share with each other. And just how young people participate in communities like that, they're starting to be both practitioners and researchers. As they participate in their communities, there's more opportunity for them to be able to play different roles in that community, to be curators and mentors within that community, to be able to reflect upon their own experiences, and we're providing them with tools. This doesn't happen automatically in online communities. In fact, it doesn't happen in most. But it's something that we can do to give young people more opportunities to play roles where they can be reflecting upon their practices, the practice of their communities that they're participating in.
It's a very good example. In particular, also that being realistic about who can be playful and how it is. So have to be sure that.
And maybe the realism is plotting it on a timeline, which is Mitch's point. You know, in the next 5 years, what realistically, who do we think is going to be able to drive change?
Yes. Yeah.
But maybe, but also if you're thinking 10, 15 years down the line, we're really talking about actually the next generation. So I often come back to investing in young people and getting that right now in the long haul is probably.
On a lot of these issues, I tend to be pessimistic in the short term and very optimistic in the long term. Because we are talking about shifting mindsets, and we know that's difficult. So in the short term, it's hard to do. We have to make our best effort, but we should be realistic on our expectations, because I think what's going to be needed to flourish in tomorrow's world will require the type of activities and capacities that we're talking about today. So I think there will be a growing recognition, and some of the type of new tools and opportunities we can provide young people today will prepare them for growing up with a different mindset.
Yeah. I think for the research network we're trying to build, exactly why we're saying research innovation network is also encourage the network memberships to be actually more playful, to understand what the motivation and incentives are to collaborate. I think that's a starting point for it.
So if we research on play, but a playful approach to research on play.
That fits perfectly, because Andreas Webstock from Aarhus University said directly that. He said, we need to think differently about research. It should be playful research. At least we should illustrate some areas of playful research. A slightly more serious thing about research also. So Jordi mentioned examples that they work directly with researchers now in hospitals to understand the influence of play in autistic children. So they, of course, in very serious conditions, playfulness have a lot of impact. But it tends to be that sometimes these studies they don't really have an impact beyond these situations. I don't know, there's a reason about scalability or how policymakers can use these studies. Do you see that similar thing? How do we scale these ideas? That kind of conversation I think about.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation that is beginning, and it's incredibly important. And I know from looking at the comments that the different groups came in that issue of scaling up came in. Like we can do some interesting, great models, but it seems to be in small locations. How do you? We struggle to take it broader, I mean, that's certainly work that we're doing at Brookings, is looking at what do we know about scaling, quality learning, holistic learning. When does it work? When does it not? What are the pitfalls? What's the process along the way? Other people have been looking at scaling. So there's an emerging body of research just on that process. But it absolutely needs to be done more of, but not just that. It's something that policymakers need in order to actually be impactful. What do I need to do? As soon as their mindset gets shifted, say we're successful in certain areas, they're going to say, well, what should I do? And we have to be ready to answer that. And they're not interested just in a lab school here or a lab school there, right? If they are in charge of a group of kids.
It's really critical also for the foundation, like systemic, scalable change. And we know that qualitatively there are very good examples, but also need quantitative arguments somehow. And that's kind of the bridge we want to make. So I think actually I'm going to wrap up right now, and some very good comments. So thank you very much, Mitch and Rebecca. It was really delightful to have you here and good discussions.
We enjoyed it and look forward to continued participation with this emerging network.
Thank you.
So as you may have noticed, so these sessions have been recorded, and we have also captured the notes from most of the sessions. We will share that with you after the session and send a link to the videos. There'll also be a little survey coming up, because we really want to know how you felt about this session, not only how the technology worked, but also the feedback and the impact and the input you got. In terms of the next step in our process, so this has been a very important milestone for our way to look at the network between research and practitioners and reshaping that network. So in the foundation, we are continuing studying how we can build that network, and we'll be ready with some feedback for you in around February, beginning of next year. The key thing we are focusing on is around the conversation we have here. What are the motivations for researchers and practitioners to collaborate? What are the ways to support the innovation process that seems to be existing, and there's a need for rethinking how we work together, new tools, new ways of measuring things, and most critically also the structure of that network and what is the role of the foundation. And we are completely honest to say that we might not be the one driving this network as more than in the beginning maybe, but actually we need much more people to be involved in the network, and we might not just be involved in the starting point of the network. So it's really to build a more self-organized movement around learning through play, and we'll get back to you next year. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Rebecca, and have a continued nice day.